All right, so let's start with the movie.
Yeah, start with the movie.
Can we see the frames? So the movie begins in a very eerie Garden of Gethsemane. And so I was just at the Garden of Gethsemane,
Does it look like that?
last November. It's way less foggy than this, or when I was there. But anyway, this also has this kind of a sense. What we're going to get with the whole movie, I feel like it has a Lord of the Rings style, fantasy style genre that it's kind of feeling, and that is happening when we're in this, this very eerie, spooky Garden of Gethsemane. Anyway, and so that's kind of where we begin. There is obviously the narrative, and it's followed a little bit. So this is drawing from the Gospels. So Jesus has gone to pray. The three core apostles who've come close with him were supposed to be praying, but they fall asleep, Peter, James, and John. And so he confronts them. They also find that the whole everything is kind of scary. They don't know what's going on. Peter talks about how earlier the night, that Jesus has talked about being betrayed and so forth. And so, Peter is just looking up at the pale moon and the full moon. It's a kind of a spooky beginning. And then in the middle of it,
this figure, yes.
Do you want to talk about this figure?
So one of the things that we may have noticed as we watched the movie, if you've seen it, is that this character, Satan, the devil, has a very, very prominent role, even though in the Gospels we don't see these dialogues between the devil and Jesus, other than in the desert, before right. Jesus starts his ministry. But here, in the Passion, in the Gospels, there's no interactions, no dialogues between Jesus and Satan or the devil. But here in the movie, it's very prominent. And so one of the reasons that I want to bring your attention to this character is that the character is going to come back throughout the movie. The character is always following Jesus around. You always see the devil and all the devil minions walking behind the crowds, driving Judas crazy and things like that. And the devil is constantly reminding Jesus that this is too much for you. You can't do this. And so we're going to see why this is one of the most important things that is happening in this movie, because this is a movie, about blood and a very just
graphic gore, torture.
Yes, but it's also a movie about salvation. And so one of the concerns I think that the creators of this movie have is something that goes back all the way to the early Christians. How does salvation happen? And the devil here is, we'll see as we go through the different scenes, the devil is telling Jesus that he can't do that because Jesus, the devil, thinks is only human. The devil doesn't understand that Jesus is also God. And this is one of in the economy of salvation, that's called sometimes the ransom theory, because the devil doesn't understand that by swallowing Jesus into death, into himself, he is actually going to allow Jesus to defeat the devil, to defeat sin, and ultimately death. And we'll see when we get there, and we'll talk a little bit more about salvation, all the different models of salvation that Christian theologians across the ages came up with, and which is the model of salvation that this movie is proposing by introducing the devil.
Right. So, this character, therefore, the devil looking like this and being placed in this way, is definitely then laying its finger down on one of these options.
And another thing that I want to point out about the devil is like this character looks very, very androgynous. It's unclear at first if it's a man, it's a woman, if it's old, young, and I think it's also deliberate because one of the things that Mel Gibson is doing from the beginning of the movie is to try to make the viewer upset. And unfortunately, in our culture and other cultures as well, one way to make people uncomfortable is when something breaks the norm, when we don't know what the gender of the person is immediately. A lot of viewers will get confused and something will tell them there's something is wrong about this character. This character introduces that discomfort constantly, and with babies that have the faces of old people and things like that also adds to that.
Right. So the idea here is androgyny, is automatically unsettling. If I want to be sympathetic to the director in doing that, the idea is the devil's a fallen angel, and so angels are also gender fluid. They don't have an actual gender identity, so therefore, in that sense, it could be trying to reference that. Anyway, so more on this character, but essentially, like Leandro is saying, there isn't one agreed upon reason actually for why Jesus, essentially had to die and how salvation is effected. It is in fact multiple different answers to that question have been given by theologians over the years, and so the fact that the devil doesn't understand who Jesus is in this depiction in the movie is showing that it's picking a particular one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but there's multiple, and so we'll see why, in a way, Mel Gibson is actually touching base on all the different models of salvation and all the different possible ways in which Jesus could save humanity.
Yeah. So the Garden of Gethsemane scene where Jesus is with the disciples, and then he's also being watched and kind of talked to by this devil figure. That's intercut then with a scene at the Sanhedrin, the Judean High Council, where they are meeting with the character of Judas, who is made an agreement with them to betray Jesus and hand him over.
But I would like to touch base, Mike, if you can go back a little bit to like the previous, the scene of Gethsemane.
Sure.
Because let's go back a little bit more and yet a little bit more. So Jesus, this is like one of the opening scenes. Jesus here is portrayed as being super distressed in a way that the Gospels don't show Jesus. Yes, I mean Jesus is praying, and Jesus I think it's in what Gospel?
It's in Luke.
Jesus
Luke
says that take this cup away from me. That's John.
Oh no, I think that's frequently.
Right. Okay.
That's a common thing, but if the bleeding from every pore is in Luke only.
Right. But Jesus here is telling
maybe a misreading of
the
Luke.
Father, take this cup away. I don't want to do this. Can we do it some other way? Mm-hmm. And this leads Jesus to cry and to just come down on his knees and all face down on the ground as the devil is telling him, well, exactly, you're only human. This is too much for you. Now, where do all these things come? This very, very weak, very, very distressed, upset Jesus, that's not in the Gospels, but it comes from another source that Mel Gibson is using for this book. This is
for the movie.
For this movie, and it's a very obscure. I had never heard about this.
I've only heard about this through the movie, right? So in other words, I've known that because frankly, this is one of this Garden of Gethsemane scene is the clip that I'd seen before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, me
and,
too.
And the reason why, the fact that it's going back and forth between Jesus and the devil, I'm like, where is this coming from? Because this does not exist in the Gospels, and so it exists in this book.
So this book is called the Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, according to the Meditations of Anne Catherine Emmerich. That's the name of the book.
That's the book.
I write it down and I'll put it in the chat. But basically, the Dolorous Passion. Anne Catherine Emmerich was a nun living in Germany. She had visions. She purportedly had stigmata and other ways of mystically connecting with Christ, and in her visions, she saw all sorts of things. Now, she didn't write anything, but there was this German poet who became really inspired by when he heard about Anne Catherine, and he spent several years documenting all these visions. Now she's been beatified by John Paul II in the early 2000s, but not for her visions, but for her piety, her virtue. Because when the Vatican scholars went through this collection of visions that this poet called Brentano, Clemens Brentano, compiled, the Vatican authorities said, this is absolutely impossible to tell what Brentano made up and whatever visions she had.
Yeah.
And this is really a long tradition that we have in Christianity that goes at least to the Middle Ages, right? Like this idea of mystics in the Middle Ages that were primarily women. And one of the reasons the mystics were primarily women, or let's say the women theologians were primarily mystics, is that was the only way women were allowed to have a voice, by claiming that her theological insight was not coming from their own mind, but was coming from the Holy Spirit, pretty much putting words in their mind. And this is how people like Julian of Norwich, or Mestild, I'm forgetting the one from Bingen.
Hildegard.
They all, even all the way up to Teresa of Avila.
Yeah.
Teresa of Avila is very, very explicit in her writings. Oh, no, this is not me because I'm just a woman. This is just God telling me all these visions. And so
this is
she was one of them. And then in this book, all these visions are what Mel Gibson is using as an inspiration for all these things that are not in the Gospels here. Pretty much almost everything, with certain exceptions, come from this book.
Right. Yeah. So if we were looking at what is this, what is this actually trying to be? So this is not certainly not a documentary of trying to find out what the historical Jesus or the events of that would have been at all. And it's actually not, it's not filming any one of the Gospels. And so each of the Gospels has their own point, and this, in fact, conflates all four of them, which is very common for Christians to do. But the problem with it is, as we'll see, since each Gospel writer has their own point of view, the way Jesus is portrayed. So sometimes here he's seeming very weak. Sometimes he's in this total power as a godlike being coming around. It's because in some cases he's being pulled from one of the traditions as opposed to the other. And then finally, it's not just a synthesis of the four Gospels. It's then all of these additional layers of Christian tradition up into modern times, including mystical visions from the 18th, 19th century, that are informing this synthesis. So it is an odd story, the way depiction all brought together.
Okay, so we can go to the second scene of the trial, which is a very complicated scene.
Well, they're interlacing still Gethsemane with Judas, right? We mentioned that.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in this because I just thought the depiction of Judas seems a little sympathetic here, although then he's obviously, as we'll see, he's possessed by...
He is possessed, yeah, and he's got the psychological thing about like the going through different processes, psychological processes, until he really regrets it at the end. But yeah, he's very possessed because the devil, remember, is running around very almost physically.
And we have obviously then after he's betrayed them, he leads them to where the Jesus and everyone is at. This is again Jesus praying and this interaction that he has with this devil character. Oh, we didn't mention this part. And
the snake here is it goes like all the way back to Genesis. I don't think we have a slide, but Jesus at some point
stomps on the head of the snake here.
Of the snake, and that anticipates what's going to happen at the end of the movie. That I know spoilers, but Jesus is resurrected.
Yeah. So this is all part of that interaction that we were talking about, drawn from this mystical tradition. Then the guards come, led by Judas. And again, we have this conflation of all of the different ways the Gospels happen. So this is sort of the portrayal of how it happens in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is always in control. He is never not in control. He is walking around as sort of like the divine being, and he's portrayed that way. Whereas in the other Gospels, he's less so. And so in the Synoptic Gospels, Judas comes and betrays Jesus with a kiss. In the Gospel of John, that doesn't happen. Instead, Jesus just says, "I am he." He identifies himself. But of course, this is then a conflation. He's standing there like that, but they get the kiss anyway.
The kiss, yeah, they get the kiss.
And so that how again the sources all come together. It becomes to this big fight, which happens in all the different Gospels. It's again in the Gospel of John that it's Peter that has a sword that cuts the ear. There's in the Gospel of Mark the young man who the guards capture his robe or whatever. He runs off. In this case,
but in this case, he kept his clothes.
He didn't. That didn't happen. But in any event, they also make that young man into the Apostle John in the movie. And like I say,
well, in general, the movie conflates
a bunch of characters together, and brings it simplifies. And so Peter is the one, of course, that cuts the ear off of Malchus, the servant, the slave of the high priest, and then of course Jesus heals him. So this conflates some things. So we get again Peter being the one with the sword. Comes from the Gospel of John, as does the name of the servant, but the healing comes from Luke, I think. So anyway, they're all brought together in these different ways. And there's almost, again, a fantastic element, or a fantasy film element, where at a certain point, after all this scuffling and fighting, it's like Peter just disappears, and the guards are like, okay, well, we got Jesus, that's what we want. And they immediately grab him. Yeah. And this is when the violence in this thing really starts. So they start just
hitting him. The violence sets in really. But there's once again, I just want to pause here because when Jesus, there's this very dramatic moment of there's all this just wrestling with Peter and the guard. And Jesus finds in the middle of all this drama, the space to heal Malchus' ear. Right. And throughout the movie, something that is made very, very clear is that Jesus is a radical pacifist, that even at this point, when people come to arrest him, he doesn't have time to oppose this aggression, this violence, but he does have time to heal one of his enemies when he's been attacked by Peter.
And this happens to a bunch of different people. So when the people like Malchus here interact with Jesus in the movie, they're then changed by him. So he doesn't go back with the rest of the guards. They all telling him, hey, we're going now, and his life has changed, I think.
And I think that I'm just trying to understand the intentions of Mel Gibson in putting this movie together.
Yeah.
Is he trying to paint a historically accurate,
I don't hope
just
not.
a version of the Passion? Well, but he does use the languages. I mean, this movie is primarily in Aramaic. He went through the trouble of actually making us viewers just get immersed in this story by having everyone speak like Latin and Aramaic.
Right.
I don't think there's anything else. But
there's a little bit of Hebrew because they're quoting the
Hebrew.
scripture, the Bible, which they should probably be quoting. Well, anyway, if it's the Old Testament there, it's okay for quoting it.
But so Jesus here is, again, now like a side note about salvation. This is why the model of salvation that is proposed in this movie is a little complicated. On the one hand, the devil, we said, clearly doesn't understand who Jesus is.
Right.
For the devil, Jesus is just a man. So the ransom theory says that God tricked the devil into thinking that Jesus is just a man, a very, very virtuous man, the most virtuous man. And the devil knows that Jesus is trying to redeem all the sins of humanity. And the devil says, this is impossible because you're a man.
Right.
Now, when Jesus dies, says this theory of atonement that goes all the way back to Athanasius, is that the devil at that moment, when Jesus dies, when the devil swallows Jesus, then at that moment, from within the devil, from within death itself, Jesus conquers death and sin, and the devil is defeated. So that's the ransom theory, or sometimes conflated with the victor, Christ victor theory, because Christ is victorious in this deceitful way. But here it's also, there's another model here that this is a very, very pure Jesus. This is an all virtuous Jesus that does this, that heals one of his enemies. And that goes back a little bit to Anselm's theory of satisfaction. The satisfaction says that our sin is so grave, like the magnitude of our sin is such that we ourselves cannot do anything about it. So God's self has to pay the satisfaction, which is something that goes to Anglo-Saxon law. And this is how we are saved. Only God is able to pay this level of satisfaction because the sin is so grave.
It's like your weregild. When in Anglo-Saxon law, if you kill somebody, then you have to your family, your clan owes that clan a certain amount of money. Otherwise, they're allowed to kill you back or whatever. In order for them to have satisfaction. And so I think it may be pulled from that idea.
Yeah,
it's certainly coming from that same time
which shows
frame, right?
how theology is always in conversation with contemporary culture. And this is like in the 11th century that Anselm is coming up with this idea, because that's what
society.
That's the society's idea of honor, and like the honor of God is such, according to Anselm, that God is the only one who can pay for this what is owed through sin.
But so anyway, he's going to get tricked.
But he's going to get tricked
in this version of it. So he does not know what's going to happen going in, and that's what's happening here.
I would say they, the devil.
They, the devil.
They, the devil.
Yeah. So during the capturing of Jesus scene, we then get introduced to Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. So it starts intercutting with them and their story. They're going to hang out with John the Beloved as he's now run away and is going to find them eventually. But essentially they begin, and they're introduced by saying the first the Passover why is this night different from all other nights? We were once slaves, now we aren't because of the Exodus. And so they're saying that that's how they're kind of introduced. But essentially, in the movie, Mary, the mother of Jesus, has sort of a psychic connection with Jesus. And so she can kind of tell that something terrible is happening, and that's why she sort of wakes up and that kind of thing.
And this quote is important because the ransom theory assumes that we are slaves of Satan. That's the assumption. And so it is only Jesus has to pay ransom for us because we're, for whatever reason, they thought, and in this early fathers, some early fathers, that our condition is enslaved of sin, enslaved of Satan. And so this goes together with what's happening here when the Marys are introduced.
Well, in the Gospel of John, anyway, the authors there are definitely making the idea that Jesus is a Passover sacrifice, and so this is the presentation in the Gospel of John that the lamb that is sacrificed on Passover, that's going to be Jesus for where the previous Passovers were all simply an antitype to the typology that Jesus represents.
Right.
So. Okay, so then this is part of the crazy violence that's happening. So they're on this, as they're getting back into the city, there's this big tall ramp or bridge or whatever, and at a certain point Jesus is in chains and they kind of kick him out over the side of a bridge, and he's falls down 2 stories or whatever and is caught in the chains, and while he's down there he sees Judas.
Judas is there.
There's Judas, and Judas, this is like beginning of Judas's descent into madness. Jesus is then taken.
And that's at that point the movie is almost. I thought it was turning into a horror movie because there's all these devils that are running around and they scare you.
You want to go to the Judas part, or
sure.
Wait? We can go ahead. Yeah, so a little bit later, as Judas descends into madness, I guess it's a little ways into the movie. Maybe
you're really skipping. We're skipping my favorite part.
Well, I thought it was going to happen right away, but we'll get back to Judas later. So anyway, we get to the house of the high priest. And this is that scene 2 you wanted to talk about.
This is the house of Caiaphas.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we see, first of all, the first thing that we notice is all these super fancy garments that these people are wearing all around. It's unclear exactly what priests and Levites were wearing at this point because there's not a lot of records.
Right.
But this may be more like what priests were wearing, like in older times, like pre-exilic times even. But that's not unclear. But definitely, it was probably super unlikely that they were wearing these things in the middle of the night when this is taking place, because this is
the full ceremonial.
This is a full ceremonial, garment that Josephus says was like the Romans were in control of, and they would only allow the priests and Levites to wear all these ceremonial outfits on special occasions. This was a special occasion because it was a Passover, but not in the middle of the night. And there's even some of the Sanhedrin, some of the members of the Sanhedrin in this scene complain, what are we doing here in the middle of the night? This is very irregular.
Why isn't the whole council here?
Right.
They're complaining that it's an irregular ceremony. Lots of people have made it into the courtyard, like Judas and the Marys, and they've been now joined by John the Beloved, and they're going to be three characters together the rest of this time. They see Peter, who's also made it there. As everything's going on, the Romans are wondering what's going on in the middle of the night too. And this is when now the language actually started to intrude on me because I know Latin, I don't know Aramaic, and so suddenly these Romans start wandering around talking Latin in their kind of modern ecclesiastical Italian version of Latin.
Yeah, they speak Italian.
But nevertheless,
you have to get over that because otherwise it's very distracting.
Yeah, But anyway, so suddenly I was starting to realize it, and then I don't know if we want to talk about the kind of the weirdness of how the language works in this movie. So on the one hand, yes, common Roman soldiers would have very likely spoken Latin.
Right.
But almost everybody, there's like a lot of bilingualism in this movie where people aren't, sometimes there's, so at a certain point, Jesus is speaking Latin to Pilate. Pilate will speak Aramaic to the Jewish
switch
leaders.
Back and forth.
He'll sometimes speak Latin to everybody, when they obviously, the crowd won't know Latin. And so what we probably should be having is when we're just dealing with the common Roman soldiers, maybe they should all be speaking Latin. When we're just with the disciples or other kinds of Jewish leaders, when they're amongst themselves only, then they should be speaking Aramaic. But anytime they are going to, Pilate and the Jewish leaders are speaking to each other, they would be speaking Greek. Yeah. And same thing.
And that I don't think there's any Greek at all.
There's no Greek
in this
movie.
movie.
I think it's so.
There seems to be in general very little awareness of Hellenism in general in the movie, and that goes also back to like the reference to what everyone is wearing.
Right. So it's completely possible that there has been a long centuries and centuries now of Hellenism. We'll see this when we get to King Herod, for example. So Herod, he's not a king, but anyway, Herod the Tetrarch. When we see his court, he's trying to be a Hellenistic king. So he's modeling himself on Alexander the Great. But in the movie, he's not portrayed that way, as we'll see. And so again, he also should be speaking Greek, probably. So the Romans are saying to everybody, hey, what's going on here? The Marys are trying to get the guards to stop them from taking Jesus, but the temple guards are able to say, no, it's just our own, we can handle our own affairs. It's just this guy, these people are crazy. It's a guy who broke one of our temple rules, and so don't bother. But then so the Romans are kind of just aware that this whole province is no fun for them to rule, and that there's always disturbances, and so the guards go back, and eventually it gets all the way up to Pilate that that something bad is brewing, and there's going to be problems. So then we go ahead and have essentially the trial of Jesus before the council. Oh, and then we have a flashback.
Yeah, flashback when Jesus invented the modern table. Yeah. Did you know that?
Yeah, so those are really very strange. So we go flashback to Jesus before any ministry while he's a carpenter, certainly an innovative carpenter.
Very innovative.
So the movie doesn't exactly explain this, but essentially the time frame, Romans have low tables, and they recline on kind of couches and as they eat. And so then he makes instead this table that's really tall, and Mary's like, what do we do with this table? And he says, well, you sit up to it. She says it's way too tall. You sit up to it on high chairs.
Yeah.
and then she says it's never going to catch on. So it is a very weird kind of comedic element, and I don't know.
I couldn't figure out what the purpose of this scene was, like what theological purpose it serves, because there's going to be more flashbacks as the movie goes on, and the other flashbacks are very intentional. They have a really clear theological function, but this one, like the table, I'm not sure what the theology of the table is.
I mean, I think there's a reason why there's no stories of the adult Jesus prior to when his ministry begins, because if he's just making, like in this case, he's making weird tables for a rich man, he says.
It's a rich man, yeah.
And so it is
rich man.
An unnamed rich man. So it is a little bit weird, and so I guess they're just trying to contrast. Mary and Jesus had been very happy before he went off and did all this stuff.
And there's only Mary and Jesus. There's never a human father around.
Well, I mean, he will have been dead by this time, according to tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not in the Gospels in Jesus' adulthood either.
At the very least, it allows you to catch up your breath for everything that is about to happen in the movie.
Yeah. So then we go, there was Mary, so now we come back to where she's here watching the trial. Jesus sees her. we interlace to Pontius Pilate's wife. And so this is an interesting character as well in the movie that's drawn from tradition. So we have we've done a lecture on Pilate. And so one of the things that is already happening by the time of the gospel writing is that Christians are sort of rehabilitating Pilate. Mm-hmm. And that continues to go full force into Christian tradition in the following centuries. And so there are later apocryphal gospels that essentially name for Pilate's wife. And so in the movie she's called Claudia Procula. This is again from later Christian tradition. I think it's the Acts of Pilate that has that in it. Maybe it's from the 5th century. And so by that time, Christian writers have fully rehabilitated Pilate and Procula, his wife, and she's, ultimately they convert after the events of the gospel and later die as Christian martyrs in that apocryphal later gospel. Her only existence in the gospel itself is a reference in Matthew, where it says that she'd had a dream because of Jesus, and she says, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I've suffered many things this day in a dream. So that's where the kind of the source, the character is only mentioned, and unnamed, Pilate's wife, and then that's where the tradition all comes from. And so she is a major background character and confidant of Pilate in the movie. And
this is one of the things that Gibson also gets from the visions of Emmerich.
Oh yeah.
Is this added information, let's say, that we learn about this character, and that helps create a contrast between Pilate. Pilate, of course, it's one of the main characters in the Passion that we have to compare with other characters that are suffering, that are going through a certain psychological tension.
Yeah.
So in Pilate's case, the problem it's one of moral. So Pilate is not necessarily evil according to this movie, and to an extent some of the gospel account, but he's a coward because Pilate understands what's right.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do what's right.
Right. Well, he's also, though, he explains to her here in this time, maybe not this scene, but like a next scene, more or less, he's given this news that the high priest has had some prophet arrested, and this is the wife knows about him, right? So she's had this dream about him, but she's trying to talk to him about it and say, don't mess around with this. Yeah. He's a just man. He's a righteous man. He says he's like, look, my truth about this, my issue is I've been assigned to this horrible, this rotten province, and if I don't let Caiaphas do that, Caiaphas is going to have a rebellion. Right. And if I do let Caiaphas do this, maybe Jesus's followers are going to have a rebellion. Either way, there's going to be a rebellion, and I'm going to get in trouble for it. And because the emperor already has told me I'm going to be in trouble, and I've been here for 11 years, and it's horrible.
And then the soldiers at that point remind him, no, there's already a rebellion.
Yeah, so there already is a rebellion going on. Yeah, and he's not a good, but he definitely in this movie, he's also not a good commander because his soldiers have no discipline and they're drunk hooligans this entire movie.
It's a very undisciplined legion.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think it's good to important to point out that that's not the real historical Pilate.
Right.
Because he was ruthless. So this sympathetic character that we have in the movie, that we also have in some early modern and even Baroque operas, like that give Pilate a very important role that is very sympathetic in a way, where you see the struggle of this character is not the real Pilate that Josephus says was very ready to to put rebellions down with no hesitation.
Right. Immediately ruthless, not sitting someone dithering around, about killing one guy. He was ready to kill lots and lots of people.
A lot of people.
That's what. Yeah. And so in other words,
which is what you had to do in that position. Like that's what you were expected to do.
And we also hear from him from Philo of Alexandria, who also portrays him as a kind of a negative, ruthless guy. Right. So. All right. So you want to go to the trial, or?
Oh, sure.
Here we go.
There we go.
So, who is this beggar you bring us who is chained up like a condemned man? The priest is asking. So the trial. A lot of the text here, I think, again, is coming from the Gospel of John. It brings it all together, but the general. I think that.
So this is Caiaphas' house,
yeah,
right? So very rich guy, Caiaphas.
Yeah, sure. He's the high priest, right? Or the high priest. He's in the family of it anyway, whether it's Ananias or him. So they're questioning him.
And again, defend yourself, but
right.
he's not going to defend himself.
Well, his lines, Jesus' lines here are taken from the Gospel of John. So he says, "I've been preaching publicly in the temple all this time. You could have listened to me then if you'd wanted to. So ask any of the people who heard me preach what I say, that kind of a thing." And so then they get all these testimony from witnesses who say different kinds of things. Like he's healing the sick by magic.
And these are, like the false accusations that the Gospels mention are happening. So everything gets really squeezed in this scene, I felt. It just happens too fast.
I don't know. My complaint about this movie was never that it was too fast. I think that it was very stretched out.
Well, the bloody scenes
are
stretched
scenes
out.
are way too long. I guess maybe this was shortened. So anyway, so they all yell different things that they say that he's been doing, and then the priest says, "Well, look, you guys are contradicting each other, so they don't feel that they've gotten what they needed until, and in fact, actually, the council here starts to break down, and so we presume some of these guys that are complaining are Joseph of meant to be Joseph of Arimathea and maybe Nicodemus. So these are the members of the council according to the Gospel of John again." Who are maybe they don't actually do this in the story itself, but anyway, that are being retrojected into this part of it. So they finally get Jesus to talk, and again he identifies himself as he does so often in the Gospel of John with the phrase "I am." When he's asked if he's the Messiah, if he's the Son of God, "I am." Is echoing what the God of Israel says to Moses at the burning bush, and then he quotes the prophecy from Daniel where he identifies himself with the Son of Man who is coming in power in the clouds, and that is the apocalyptic figure that is also, understood in the Gospel of Mark and so forth.
And that is when the Sanhedrin decides, okay, this is blasphemy.
Yeah, well, which it is. So if he's not God, it would be blasphemy. So they rend their garments. They feel like they've got it. They're committed now. They're done with him. So they want they would like to be able to kill him if they could.
And Judas is there.
And that's where maybe now we're going to get to the scene where Judas runs off and goes mad. But,
here comes the denial.
We have the denial first.
And the denial again happens all at once. Which I don't think it happens all at once in any of the Gospels.
No.
It just happens in different places at different times. But here it's just like one after another.
Yeah, it was super accelerated.
Yeah, which actually detracts from what really happens to Peter. That is like it's this Peter. It takes him a while to understand like what's going on there, and this is again like a different kind of psychological pressure that Peter is feeling compared to what Judas is feeling and compared to what Pilate is feeling. But it's like
it's really accelerated here because, like you say, he meets 3 different people right in a row, and he denies each time, you know, and then immediately after he does it 3, you know, there's a flashback to Jesus' prediction of the betrayal, and then Jesus catches Peter's eye when he hears him denying him, and Peter then sees him, and so. And then Peter runs immediately to.
And it's all at once, yeah.
To the 2 Marys and John, who have, you know, like I said, have performed this triad and are hanging out together for the rest of the movie. And Peter explains that he's denied, and then he runs off, and that's the end of him in the movie, right?
We don't see him again?
I think that's the end.
Okay.
So his story, Peter's story anyway, especially got pretty truncated, as you say, because.
Gibson is not interested in him, I guess.
It may be that the source that you were talking about of the.
Well, the source is follows
Peter.
Mary.
Yeah.
Around.
So,
Emmerich has, in her visions, a lot to say about Mary, and I get the impression that a lot of these psychic powers that Mary appears to have in this movie come from this
Emmerich,
content from Emmerich.
Yeah, so for example, I was reading that one of the things that came out of her visions is that she described what Mary's house in Ephesus and where it was and things
which
like
now
that.
is a pilgrimage site.
And so then later, based on the vision that she had, somebody went to Ephesus in the 19th century, the ruins, and went out and found a building, and they decided, okay, this is it.
That's the house.
Now it's a shrine. So yeah, so yeah. Anyway, so then we go back to Judas has been watching this too. Now he's had a change of heart. He wants to give the silver back, and the priests don't take it back. That's none of their business. This is the aftermath of Judas as told in the Gospel of Matthew. And so we've talked before about how with Judas specifically we have just an outright contradiction between how Judas's fate is in the Gospel of Luke and Luke's continuation in Acts, and the one that occurs in Matthew. And so the movie dispenses with the Luke and Acts version and instead just does the Matthew version.
And there, if you go back before we go to the next scene.
This one? What do you mean?
And the next one. And the next one. Oh, I thought it like the Judas with the officials. Where was that?
It was right here.
There you go. Yeah, and so here, something important is like Judas understands, Peter now Peter understands, and then again Judas now understands, and even Pilate is beginning to understand what is going on with Jesus, and here is clear what the story is trying to tell here, like the priests do not understand. Right. The priests don't understand that Jesus is innocent, but Pilate.
Right. If you think he's innocent, you betrayed that. That's your
Pilate,
affair. That's
Judas, and Peter do understand. However, neither of those 3 characters are able to do the right thing.
Yeah.
They do different things. One is like betrayal that leads to guilt, and then Peter feels this pressure. Like we have a flashback where Jesus tells, where Peter tells Jesus, I'm going to be with you, I'm going to die with you, I don't care.
Right, and Jesus says, you'll betray me 3 times.
You're going to betray me.
Right.
And then you're going to betray me, why? Because you will feel fear, which is what happens to Peter at this point. So he collapses, his moral ground collapses when he faces fear. Yeah. And in Pilate's case, it's just like, well, I know what's good, I know what's right, but I have my duty, I have my job.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, so that's where. So it's interesting how all of these are done. So this brings us to Judas, like I said, as up to this point, a fairly sympathetic, because he isn't even given the real motivation about why he was doing it. He was already sort of regretful, it seems like, when he first betrayed Jesus. Now he's super regretful, but now we have a kind of a very fantasy descent into madness. So these kids find Judas outside the city. He's like, leave me alone. And then it turns out these kids are like demons. they start biting him and stuff, and they're really freaky and gross. And then this whole host of little kids are chasing him around.
Yeah, and this is almost like, I think there's a lot of I thought a lot of references to classical mythological themes.
Okay.
Like I thought of, for example, Orestes and the Furies.
Yeah.
That just chase him around everywhere he goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And the devil is, of course, among them, right?
And the devil is there once again.
That's an omnipresent character in the movie. And so then he hangs himself, which, like I said, is the Matthew version.
Is that Italy?
So yeah, so this is interesting that this is where the setting started to really become apparent to me. So this is in in like southern Italy, in the Basilicata. So it is I don't know, the area between Apulia and Calabria, and there's this really rocky town or city, and then there's also a ghost town that got abandoned, and so it's set in those two things. Where did I put the information on the set?
Yeah, it makes me want to go there, but I'm sure it's full of tourists now.
Okay, it's so yeah, the oh no, that's not it. Oh, I found it. Okay, yeah. So it's Matera is the town, and then Krakow is the ghost town. And so it's interesting that in addition to, I guess, being also a setting for the James Bond movie Quantum of Solace, Krakow has been used in a bunch of Bible movies. So in the 1979 movie Christ Stopped at Eboli, the 1985 movie King David, the 2006 movie The Nativity Story. So this place, I guess, looks to Hollywood like Jerusalem, and so, but it doesn't really, because it's way too tall and rocky, and so
there's some pretty cool rocks, and the town is super cool.
So I definitely kind of started seeing, whoa, this is a kind of a crazy setting. There's just a brief scene here where, again, Mary is exercising her psychic bond with Jesus. So after the trial is over, she goes out to the courtyard and on the ground, puts her head to the ground, and then realizes that Jesus is in the prison right underneath her, and he can sense her too. So anyway, I don't know. I guess they're just showing that psychic bond.
Once again, don't condemn him.
We go back and see that Pilate's wife is still arguing with him about this. This, I think, is when he's saying, look, I don't want to be in this rotten place, but I got to keep order here. And so we go to now the trial before Pilate, and so he's brought to his the courtyard of his presidium or whatever, and then and he starts the kind of trial.
Right, and this is, I guess, from when we try to do like an exegetical analysis, this is something that the gospel tell us they have to bring Jesus to Pilate because they didn't have the authority to execute him.
Right.
Which is it's apparently that may have been the case. There were like some exceptions to that. Mm-hmm. That when the priests themselves could execute someone for just like there's records of the priests executing Gentiles for entering the temple when they should have, but like usually that would make the Roman procurator super mad. So right. This was apparently standard procedure to bring the accuser to the Roman procurator, but of course in this case a Roman procurator doesn't want to kill anyone apparently.
Well, which again is it's what's portrayed in the Gospels in that case, but it also is probably not what is true historically. So as we saw, Pilate, the historical figure, is a ruthless guy, and it's easy to kill obvious rebels, and so he wouldn't find as big a problem with it. But obviously his wife, according to the gospel account in Matthew, but then a much more elaborated tradition is telling him, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, and so he's trying to get out of it. And so the priest,
and this is ultimately the accusation that is supposed to raise suspicion.
Right. Yeah, they go down a whole list of things that Pilate doesn't care about, and then the other priest says, "Oh wait, I got some stuff that you will care about."
Juicy.
So he's the leader of a large, dangerous sect. He calls himself the son of David. That is to say, he is a pretender to the royal house here, and he's supposedly therefore the king, the promised king of the Jews. And so this is an insurrection, and so you need to put him down because you can't be a friend of Caesar and let this rebel live. So that causes Pilate to bring him into the inner chamber, and this is again kind of from the Gospel of John, where there's this elaborate going back and forth in and out, where where the counselors won't go into Pilate's house because it'll defile them or something like that on the Passover. And so they go back and forth. That doesn't exist in all the Gospels, but that's being pulled from John, and that's what's going on here. And so then this is where Pilate then...
This is one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Because Pilate starts talking Latin to Jesus.
Jesus speaks Latin! Yes, see?
So, and I never thought that Jesus spoke Latin, but here we found out that he not only knew Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek, but also Latin. I think that in a Mel Gibson movie, if a Scythian came up, that Jesus would be able to talk Scythian to him if he wanted to, because he's already got all of these abilities in the movie. So.
So this is a pretty entertaining Latin conversation between Jesus and Pilate. So
yeah. So he gives him some of these kinds of Jesus teachings. My kingdom isn't of this world. If it were of the world, my followers wouldn't have let me be, delivered over to you. Oh, so you are a king? He doesn't say thou hast said it, which is one of the lines. He misses that good line. But he goes instead to a lot of the dialogue for Jesus everywhere, especially pulls from the Gospel of John. And so he starts saying, all the who hear the truth, hear my voice, and that leads to this great "What is truth?" line that everyone loves from Pilate. And so then
which
Pilate
he will go back to the veritas. We hear the word veritas,
veritas,
truth, a lot when Pilate speaks Latin,
as the movie goes on,
to his wife.
Yeah, so he goes back and has a conversation with her where he's like, can you tell the difference between, do you understand what truth and not when you hear it? And she's like, yeah, I do. I get it a lot.
I get it.
She's a visionary and all that kind of thing. He's like, he's more or less forgotten where he put truth, right? So he doesn't know what truth is when he hears it anymore. But he does hear that Jesus is from Galilee, and so then he realizes, hey, I'm procurator over Judea, not Galilee, Judea and Samaria. And so I'm going to give him to Herod, Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, who is in charge of Galilee and the Perea, who happens to also be in town for the Passover.
This starts to sound like a Kafka story.
This only happens in the Gospel of Luke. So this detail happens in the movie. So we go and see Herod, who is...
This is also a very funny scene.
Yeah. He is not a Hellenistic monarch, so he is not dressed like he would have been, like a very Greek acting, wanting to be a little Alexander kind of king. Instead, he's dressed in the sort of Western fantasy of Orientalizing.
Right.
So what decadent, effeminate, debauchery kind of caricature of what Persians would look like.
Yeah, and I think the aesthetics here is drawing a lot from like Baroque drama.
Yeah.
That if you want to see something like that today, you have to go and see a Vivaldi or a Handel opera, where like in modern times you have these countertenors. Back then they would have been these castratos, who are all these characters, like male characters singing with female voice.
Yeah.
And there's, for example, one that is Artaxerxes, that is always about this exuberant, decadent wealth of these Oriental kings. And so you have all these castratos, like all dressed like this, with these crazy eyeliner like Herod Antipas has here, in a very, what would for us now be kind of effeminate, but back then would have been like this extreme delicacy and movements of hand. And it's also like almost orgiastic. It's like really suggesting that these are a bunch of degenerates here.
Right, and that's what's portrayed here.
But it's a total caricature of what the real Antipas would have been, which would have been someone who looked very Hellenistic,
right,
and trying to make sure that he pleased the Romans.
Yeah, although in the Gospels, where when he has his. He's not operating a great court, it's his niece or whatever who is able to ask him for a boon. But it's a very Greek story thing to have happen, and that kind of a thing. Anyway, in this case, he is excited to see him. This is sort of like what happens in the Gospel of Luke. He doesn't condemn him though, and so therefore he sends him back. The priests did not get satisfaction. They just want somebody to kill him. And so Herod here in the movie just says, no, he's not a criminal, he's just a crazy person. And so he ships him back to the priest take him back to Pilate. Now Pilate's wife is still trying to work through him. He's just saying, this is where we've gotten, he doesn't like being here. This is Pilate's struggle this entire time has been, he doesn't want to be governor of this horrible province.
But again, this movie, one of the things that is happening in this movie is a lot about what's happening in all the mind of all these characters, because they're all struggling, because they begin to understand who Jesus is, and yet they're caught into their regular lives and in the roles they represent. As they're discussing like also
just
once again
job.
Truth here.
Yeah. So that's right. So that was when he was asking her about truth and how does she understand it.
And so the movie portrays, like, it's one of the things that is drawing our attention to is like this transformation that is happening in all these people, not just Pilate and Peter and Judas, but in everyone.
Right. The servant Malchus, who had his ear cut off and healed, is obviously
he was transformed immediately.
And we're going to see like the person who gets most transformed is Simon of Cyrene.
Right.
I mean, that guy had just has an amazing experience in the movie. So finally, we have another trial before Pilate. Pilate has now been reminded that he has this custom or this tradition where on the Passover he frees one criminal. He wants to be able to free Jesus of Nazareth. So he brings a really crazy, insane person, this clear murderer named Barabbas. And he's played to being a real villain and everything like that, and ask, which one of these do you want me to free? I'll free one of the two of them. And so the priests in the audience are like, yeah, free Barabbas. We want Barabbas, and they all start shouting Barabbas.
That's not a real historical tradition.
No. So again, it goes back. It's a gospel tradition.
It's a gospel
it is in
tradition,
the Gospels.
but
it's part of the literary idea that the Gospels bring, and so it again is part of the rehabilitation of Pilate. Is having him come up with these different ways where he's trying to do this. This is the place unfortunately in the Gospel of Matthew where we have the he says I guess it's going to happen here because he's about to it's not place yet. I forgot. I jumped ahead because actually what he's going to do now is he actually says, okay, he released Barabbas and he's still going to draw it out. So he's going to say, okay. He says to the crowd, I'm not killing this guy. I'm going to punish him. We're going to make it hurt, but then I'm going to let him go. And they're all upset about that because they don't want that. They want him to be killed.
They want him crucified.
So
this is where they call him to be crucified?
Yeah. And no, they want him to be crucified, but he's going to just punish him. And so he's sending him off with the centurion, Abinader here, in order to go and have him whipped. And so this is where the movie starts to get
this is when it gets crazy.
Insane in terms of the movie being really, really gory, right? And so then, Jesus is taking it as they continue to whip him and they get out.
Yeah, and this scene especially, it just goes on and on and on, totally unnecessarily.
Yeah, like Peter, over the course of a whole night, betrays
Right,
Jesus
like-
3 times, and it takes 15 seconds of the movie or whatever. Whereas this is like, I don't know, half an hour. It felt like it just doesn't end. And so then they just get out more and worse, cat o' nine tails, and taking flesh out, and parts are flying, and goop and gore. The problem for me is so maybe I'm sure Mel Gibson is feeling this as he's like watching it, and this gives him an incredible emotional reaction because it is just so over the top.
Yeah.
My natural defenses go up, and I don't even see this as I just see this as it became for me, like a video game or a cartoon, where it doesn't. I don't know. So I didn't have the reaction. A lot of people are saying how their reaction to this is that it becomes very emotional, but it was just so much that maybe it's a defense mechanism.
Yeah, and at some point Jesus is so disfigured that he almost doesn't look human anymore. Yeah. But this is like the scene where we get 2 breaks because we have 2 flashbacks here.
Okay.
And the flashbacks in this case, as opposed to the flashback of creating the tall table, the flashbacks here do have a very, very important theological point. Like, the first flashback is here.
Yeah.
As Jesus is being scourged like that, first we go back to the washing of the feet.
Right. So this is a scene in the Gospel of John only where Jesus is presenting a spiritual practice that is showing that servanthood ministry.
It's like this, like the paradox of a king or a lord that is a servant, and demonstrated by like washing feet, which is something that the lowly slaves would do to their masters. Here, the master is the one doing that to his students, slaves.
So it's the upside down kingdom.
So it's an upside down thing, and then in a way, like in all this flagellation is playing against this. This is what like the world, like the earthly powers do to people, as opposed to this act.
Right. The authority down is violent and oppressive. Here it is an authority that is serving and empowering.
Although also there's also the
other one is.
There's also the motif of cleansing going on, because in one way here Jesus is cleaning dirty feet with water.
Yeah.
Whereas at the same time in the movie, what we're seeing is the sins of all humanity that being washed with Jesus' blood.
Yeah. What was the other flashback? I don't have screen cap.
And the other flashback is when we see the woman taken in adultery.
Oh, that's still to come. So that's still to come. All right. So another thing that's just happening in this gore is So one thing is, again, Satan's still there, and now Satan has
a crazy baby,
dwarf baby with furry back. It's very strange. And meanwhile, Pilate's wife has found the Marys, and she's given them a whole bunch of linen. And then after all of this just horrific, Jesus is dragged away. The centurion wasn't paying attention. Again, these guys are drunk soldiers. They're not doing a good job. He says, "Hey, I told you that you weren't supposed to kill him." And they're kind of mad that they went overboard. I don't know. I'm mad they went overboard too. This is the movie going overboard. Anyway, there's a lot of blood. And so the Marys now have this linen that they got from Pilate's wife. You can see John's there too. And they start getting all the blood. Everybody is very aware of the need to preserve relics right now. So this is just one of the many relics that are being created right on the spot here, so that can be preserved, I guess, according to tradition in the Middle Ages and down to the present. So there's a lot of blood that they are able to save. So.
Yeah, and here she takes her head covering, and that's it.
Mary Magdalene.
We see her hair for the rest of the movie.
She puts her
She puts something back at the end.
At the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. So meanwhile, the Roman soldiers have decided that they haven't done enough taunting, so they make the crown of thorns, which they put on Jesus' head. And again, we just see that blood dripping. There's a lot more just unending gore. Now we have the flashback to the woman taken in adultery. So Jesus writing in the sand. This is the pericope adulteri that has been inserted into the Gospel of John, a very beloved Jesus story tradition. But it turns out that it's these same priests that wanted to stone the woman.
Right.
He says off camera that he without sin cast the first stone. They all drop their stones, and then we find out that the woman taken in adultery, fully anonymous person in the gospel, is actually,
in this case,
Mary Magdalene
in the movie.
Yeah.
But also, like in one of the theological points, I think that we're seeing here is like what happens in this scene in the gospel, which is often misinterpreted by a lot of preachers, is Jesus refuses to condemn her.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas here, everyone is accusing Jesus, and at the same time, like we see this scene that is the opposite. Yeah. And there's a play of silence, because there's a lot of, yes, Jesus says, whoever casts the first stone, but there's a lot of play in this scene in the gospel with silence, and Jesus just stands up and goes down and just writes something that we don't know what it was, on the sand, and he stands up again. And as he does all this in silence is when everyone just drops their stones and walks away.
Right. There they all go.
So the silence is also what's happening here in the passion narrative, that Jesus doesn't really do much to defend himself.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. There's good, because again, there's only so much. Here, there's only so much that happens in the course of, like the torture sequence of Jesus, and so being able to flash back and get some of these ideas, I think, is well done. So, the soldiers have given now Jesus a robe and a scepter, and they're mocking him and that sort of thing, and now they've brought Pilate back, and so now we're getting to this final moment with Pilate. And so Pilate, once again, he says this famous line from the Gospel of John, "Behold the man."
And he says it in Latin.
He says it in
Latin, ecce homo.
Because everybody wants to say ecce homo,
ecce
right?
homo.
Well, actually, he says ecce.
He says ecce.
Ecce, he says. Right. Anyway, but all right. Oh, well. And so then, of course, they all yell, "Crucify him." And so at this point, Pilate gives up. He tries to get Jesus to do anything to say, get out of this. And he says, "You don't have any power over me, only what God has given you to do." And we have a little flashback to Jesus at the Last Supper, and now where he's like now. Pilate then washes his hands, and he says, "Look, I don't want to do it. Yeah. You do it." And that's where
we get this very infamous
the thing with the crowd,
quote,
which is not translated in the movie.
Well, apparently they did say it in the Aramaic.
They say it in the Aramaic, I guess, but they don't.
It was not.
They didn't translate it.
They didn't put it in subtitles.
Right. So this line from the Gospel of Matthew, which unfortunately has been a source for Christian anti-Semitism, which is, his blood be on us and upon our children. And so it's not the intent of the author of Matthew to have that be meaning upon all the Jews for all time. It's in fact written as a prophecy that is fulfilled when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. And so in other words, it is talking about the people in Jerusalem, and Matthew is writing that from the retrospective of the fact that that Jerusalem did get destroyed, and so he's essentially making a self-fulfilled prophecy in creating that, but unfortunately that's not how it's been read.
But it's clear that Gibson wanted that to be in the movie, because it is, and I guess if you understand Aramaic, you can probably hear it. It's just not.
Fortunately, I can't. So
there's no subtitles there, but so before we we move on, because I think we were, at this point, we start the Via Crucis, I guess. There is a theological point to all the violence.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this is something that Christianity has to wrestle with, because it is that there is a lot of violence in the Passion narrative that is supposed to be part of this atoning process. This is how salvation happens, like this. Yes, Gibson really exaggerates like the gospel account, but there is violence in the gospel account.
Sure.
And the movie starts with a quote from Isaiah. The movie says, like, he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his stripes we are healed. And I just want to sing Handel's Messiah now. But and with his stripes. So that is part of the Christian faith.
The interpretation of the Old Testament suffering servant, which is a poetic figure, prophetic figure, and a symbolic figure in the Old Testament, and like you say in Isaiah and the Psalms and things like that, is then interpreted by Christians to prefigure Jesus, and then a lot of the different, like you're saying, a lot of the different salvation models that Christian theologians have come up with, pull that in, and so that's the basis for this. That's why in those arguments that this is important. So.
And so once again, like playing with all these models of salvation, here we have several models at play. So yes, we have this penal substitution. That's like one of the early Protestant Reformation takes on this ransom theory of salvation. So basically, Jesus is the substitute for the price of our sins. There's
either it's owed to Satan, or it's owed just intrinsically because
we owe it, because it's our sin, but we cannot pay it. And it's once again, it plays back into Anselm's idea that this is such a great sin that requires a divine solution. We are not able to fix it ourselves. But there's also Abelard's kind of moral influence idea that starts to become more and more apparent in the movie as we go through the transformation that all these different characters from Malchus to, not only Simon of Cyrene, but even the soldiers and even the Sanhedrin, the members of the Sanhedrin themselves, they're all transformed as they realize that who Jesus really is. And so Anselm's theory of salvation of moral influence is like we are transformed by the suffering that we're witnessing when we look at Jesus. This is something that was like, so Anselm is, in a way, was responding to Anselm.
Abelard was responding to Anselm.
Sorry, Abelard was responding to Anselm. But in this era of very fertile mysticism that was the Middle Ages in Europe, we also had Julian of Norwich. And Julian of Norwich, another one of these mystic women who was a theologian who had to pretend that her theology came from visions because otherwise...
I don't know. She's not necessarily pretending. She believed that.
She did have visions,
so
but
you're saying that you're saying in order for that to be accepted, that's how it had to be presented. I'm not saying that I don't know that she was pretending though. I think she believed that.
Oh, I do believe she had visions. And by the way, if you're an anchorite, if you live the rest of your life in an enclosure, a pretty tiny enclosure,
walled into a cell
in a church, and you only have 2 or 3 windows
and a cat.
She had a cat?
I think so.
Oh, well, of course she had a cat. But so of course you're going to have visions at some point. But she had
Absolutely.
visions before. No, I think she only had visions once in her lifetime that she transformed her, and she wrote about these visions forever, like throughout her life. But one of the her works, she talks about being pretty much transformed or enlightened, however you want to see it, by having this vision where she looks into the wounds of Christ. And that was her meditation, meditating on the exposing herself, her thinking, her mind, and in this case, like, because she had visions, even her vision, to the wounds, the vivid pain, visual pain that she was getting in these visions is, for her, was a vehicle towards salvation.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of this in Emmerich's visions as well, that remember Mel Gibson is using as source for this movie.
Yeah.
She has a lot to say, lengthy graphic descriptions of all the wounds of Christ, that again in this, although when we actually see a movie where we actually see with our own eyes what these visions are, it's quite disgusting. But these are the visions that these women were talking about.
Yeah, somehow when it's a mystic vision, it's so different from there's a difference between a mystic vision and a movie.
Yes.
You know what I mean? In other words, there's like I can see this, ecstatic imagination where you are seeing something that is transformative, whereas when you're seeing something that is so graphic and gory with bits flying and all this goop dripping and everything like that, this I don't know. I don't respond to it the same way that maybe she's doing it. Maybe somebody does.
This is not presented as a mystical vision. This is presented as if it were real, which there's another problem with that comes with, there's a huge theological contradiction that I find in this scene.
Yeah, this one back here with the where before this part where he's being whipped, right?
Yeah. So this part
because he's showing again, like, he's the Gospel of John's Jesus in total control with superhuman ability to receive like all the wounds, and so he's not crying out, he's not doing and he stands back up after they put him down and all this kind of thing. And so then like you're saying, theologically, if he can take it all like that in a superhuman way, is it really a human that is suffering?
That is one of the big issues that was so important from the early fathers, to establish that Jesus was in fact human, and Jesus was human like us, because that was very important for salvation. If Jesus is not human, then salvation in this model, in any of these models, salvation cannot happen. If we have a God that doesn't really understand suffering, I mean, intellectually, God understands what suffering is, but God has never felt suffering in God's own person. So that doesn't work. Salvation doesn't work, because how do we even connect to a God like that? So that was one of the things that led to all these councils.
Yeah, this is one of the issues with the difference between the synoptic Jesus and the Jesus in the Gospel of John's. The reason why this difference in how Jesus is walking around in the Gospel of John can lead to docetism, like you're saying. It isn't a docetic text, but there's no way, the docetic Christians, in other words, people who think that Jesus only appears because
Yeah.
he's an actual divine being who knows everything. He can speak Latin to Pilate, and he can speak
Right.
Scythian to the Ethiopian to the eunuch who comes or whatever, because he has all he's not actually experiencing normal humanity, and so that certainly is a type of early Christianity that was a path that then ended up not being orthodox. And ultimately suppressed by the Orthodox.
And it's not only because in the movie, clearly, it's not just the body. The mind of Christ is also very
transcending
of Jesus. It's very human as well. It's a mind that struggles like a human mind. But
in parts of the movie.
In parts of the movie,
but then the movie's schizophrenic that way because it's pulling from all of the different
sources.
Yeah.
But here, the issue is, as this scene goes on forever, it becomes more and more clear, even to the Roman soldiers, that something is wrong here. This guy, at some point, they look at each other and
they're being changed
shock.
now too.
They are being changed, because this is not an ordinary human, which doesn't really work for salvation if that's the case. So that's a theological hiccup there.
Okay, do you want to get to the Via Dolorosa?
Let's do it.
So, Pilate sending him off to be crucified, and so we have this scene, which again is very ongoing. It goes on and on and on, and is very gory as Jesus drags the cross all through from Pilate's place all the way to where he's going to be crucified. And in the course of doing this, the source of this is, again, way less the Gospels and way more the tradition of the stations of the cross. Mm-hmm. And so the stations of the cross, if you go to a lot of different churches, especially Catholic churches, but it's different Protestant traditions too, Anglican and Lutheran churches, where they will depict 14 stations, and those will be set around the church building. There'll be like a little image. And not all of these have any, are actually even rooted in the Bible.
No.
But nevertheless, they derived ultimately from the Middle Ages, from the Crusader period, where people were going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they were trying to experience kind of all of these things. And there's an actual road, the traditional road in medieval Jerusalem, in the present day, the Via Dolorosa, which is where it traditionally is set from the place where Pilate's camp is meant to be, to the just north of the temple, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Uh-huh. And so then by the time you get to the 1500s, these become standardized, and so you'll see them in all kinds of different churches. And so apparently Mel Gibson is really filming it this way, and we're also seeing how, because this is art, how this is, again, not meant to be depicted what Roman crucifixion actually looks like, but rather what the art of this looks like. And they are recreating the different images of the stations of the cross. I'm going to cough. Excuse me.
Oh, I couldn't catch that, folks. Sorry about that. Well, so the sources are really interesting. I had to look it up a little bit, because there's more sources that we have here. We have a lot of what we see in this scenes as Jesus walks the cross to the Golgotha rock. Mary, actually the two Marys and John are just following Jesus around, which I don't think that's in any of the Gospels. They mention that Mary. The Gospels mention that Mary is at the end, but not at each one of these stations. And this is something that is from Emmerich's book. Emmerich does follow Mary around a lot in her visions. There's a lot of what is happening with Mary. As a result, this becomes a movie where we see a lot of the reaction of the mother, and I don't know if Mel Gibson is kind of suggesting that Mary Magdalene is like the spouse or partner of Jesus.
I don't know.
But they definitely follow, the two women are constantly, well, and John.
So it's a triad with those three.
Yeah. They are constantly reacting to all the suffering. And so we not only get the suffering as a result by looking at Jesus, but we get what the loved ones are feeling as well, which that's again a little bit you mentioned, like or I mentioned, there's a little bit of a connection I see with literature and mythology. We have like Hecuba, for example, in just mourning the death of Hector, and so that is part of how we understand the suffering and the emotional component of the story. It's not just seeing the hero suffering, but also like the women, the mother, the spouse, how they react,
or the companion too, because you have Achilles and Patroclus, because we actually have here John.
Actually, we have John here
and Jesus. So we have mother and then the two beloved disciples, Mary Magdalene and John the Beloved. And so, like you said, one of the things, the fourth station of the cross, not a biblical thing, but it's a Christian tradition that becomes a station of the cross, I guess, is Jesus meets his mother in the course of this, and that happens here. And then we get a flashback to, like her being the mother to a child, Jesus, and who has fallen down. And so it's, she's there in the same exact way, and so that happens as a flashback.
The Gospels don't say that Jesus falls, do they?
So we don't have anything.
We don't have anything about that.
So there's no traditions like that at all. So so this is presenting a child Jesus that would be very fully human.
Right.
So like I say, there's a schizophrenia to the movie between whether we're deciding that we have the kind of the Gospel of John Jesus, who is saying, look, see, mother, I make all things new. He's, in other words, he doesn't have to, no matter how much it looks like he's covered with gore and things like that, he's not suffering to a certain extent because he's transcending it all.
Right.
Whereas you also have, though, when he was a little kid, that he falls from scrapes like anybody else. So it's kind of it's showing both kinds of ideas in the movie. So that like you say, then Mary is there and she's able to interact with him in the one time. That's one of the stations of the cross, the fourth station of the cross. But then she's otherwise present the whole time,
even there.
As is Mary Magdalene. To get to that, we went through a couple more of these. I thought one of the other effective intercuttings is as Jesus is now surrounded by these crowds that are jeering him as he's carrying the cross. He like looks and he sees what happened just a week before, earlier that week in Palm Sunday, where he's riding on the donkey and he's seeing all the same crowd, as they were putting palm fronds down, and so I thought it was an effective interlacing that happens.
There are some smart things that
this is designed to look like all of the artwork of the Stations of the Cross. Again, here's Satan, so this is back to that source.
But even like the fact that it's like a cross that he's carrying.
Right, as opposed to just
that would not have been the case.
Right, the cross beam or whatever they might have carried.
Just a beam.
But that doesn't look good on the art.
Yeah, that doesn't
the paintings always have the full cross.
A lot of the scenes are like paintings in a way, or art, inspired by art, and there's the devil again.
Right. And then the gore again. And so there's the Mary. That's one of the Stations of the Cross. Now we finally, he was dragging this cross around for a long time. I'm like, where is Simon Cyrene already? And so finally we get to the point where he can't carry it anymore. And so they get
this dude just
Simon
help
Cyrene to do it. He doesn't want to, but eventually he does. And so then he actually, over time, he changes his mind and he's actually in it with Jesus the whole way at a certain point. So he's again one of these characters who's very transformed. Simon Cyrene is in the three synoptic gospels, an otherwise unknown character who helps Jesus carry the cross. Not in the Gospel of John, because again, in John, Jesus is always in command, and so he carries his own cross.
That would not work for
John. The movie has to have both, right? So we have the Gospel of John, Jesus very front and center, but we also have the the Markan Jesus
Which
and Synoptic
really,
Jesus.
really shows the problem that is very common if you ever go to a church on Sundays of people constantly conflating the gospel accounts because they don't really work well together. Like this is just like this schizophrenia.
They have a different image that they're trying to portray, and so then we're getting both images more or less interspaced. One of the other Stations of the Cross comes. So Saint Veronica comes with a cup. She's going to try to give Jesus a drink while there's a lot of chaos and fighting going on around. But before she gives him a drink, she takes her head veil and she wipes his face. That's going to create another relic. So Saint Veronica has a shroud or whatever that has this image that existed at some point or other at the end of the Middle Ages in the Vatican, and I guess it's been refound.
Oh, really?
So I think it's at St. Peter's.
But her story is in this.
But it doesn't go all the way back to antiquity. It's from Middle Ages.
Her story, so it's not in the Gospels, but it's in this Acts of Pilate or the Gospel of Nicodemus.
Yeah.
Where she appears, but there's no mention in that gospel of this.
Well, they said
scene.
that she wipes the face, right?
It wipes the face.
But in any event, like I say, that artifact,
But it's a Middle Ages thing.
It's only known as of like even at the end of the Middle Ages, of the modern times. There's references to it existing in St. Peter's. So essentially, somebody has an artifact at some point or other, but they get all of the artifacts. The earliest artifacts that anybody has are from the 4th century, and so in a lot of cases, in the Vatican they have something that they've been hanging on to for 1,000 years, even. But it doesn't mean that in some cases more, all the way up to 1,600 years or so. But there's those crucial, let's say 300 to 700 years that get from Jesus's time to, or rather from when those artifacts start to appear to Jesus's time. There's no connection at that point with those, but they're traditional things.
Now, some say that her name Veronica is a play of words of a Latin, like true image.
Oh.
Vera icon.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've not heard that. I like that. Yeah. So a character that may have been then made up in order to explain
this is a true image.
In order to explain this artifact that they had gotten in the Middle Ages at some point. So this is where we start to see this city is not Jerusalem.
Awesome city.
It's a crazy
not
cool
Jerusalem.
city. and it's also, these guys are going off to a very rocky, mountainous, cliffy Golgotha, which again is a lot more than exists in the immediate variety.
That's why poor Jesus, he's struggling with that cross to go all the way up there.
Yeah. So, he falls a bunch of times. Those are more Stations of the Cross, and they do all the Stations of the Cross except 2 of them. And again, as we see Simon of Cyrene through the course of this, he's pretty much transformed.
Yeah, and once again, that's Abelard, like this moral influence.
And so we flash back to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is preaching, love your neighbor, as opposed to, he said, love your enemies even. Pray for those who persecute you, and that is going to come into play because he is going to pray for everybody who's persecuting
And once
him.
again, I think Gibson makes good use of these flashbacks at the right time.
Yeah.
And also for pacing of the movie, because otherwise it's just this
it would be so gory.
Constant horror.
Yeah. But it's also interlaced with the Gospel of John, Jesus. So he's also talking about how he has the power to lay down this countenance and to take it back up again, so we have both Jesuses. So we know, how it's going to go. Continues to be very gory, and that continues as they nail him to the cross in a very graphic way. And so it's one of the 2 times in the movie that he says, "The Father forgive them, for they know not what they do" line.
Right. And here is like we begin to see, because like all the family of Jesus,
Right.
the two Marys and John, they have been
We've been getting reaction shots off
reacting
them the whole time,
and
right?
like suffering through this whole
Yeah.
movie with us. And then at this point, as we can see in John's face here, he begins to be transformed. And once
Yeah.
again, by like this witnessing, this horror,
Yeah.
he begins to be transformed, begins to understand really what is going on, and very much in like what Julian of Norwich is suggesting in
Yeah.
her visions.
Ugh,
Skip.
okay.
And the same thing with her. Like
With Mary Magdalene, yeah.
she had been weeping the whole time. Now she has this other countenance that she's
Yeah.
beginning to grasp what is going on
And so that's
at
gonna
this
make her
moment,
recover
at the
her
most
hair.
horrible moment.
Yeah. And so they raise up the cross. It's already very gruesome.
He still doesn't understand.
Yeah. So the priest comes and he says, you said you're going to destroy the temple and raise it up again in 3 days, which obviously it's not meant literally to mean the temple. But nevertheless, well, as we're going to see in the movie, the temple does get destroyed in a way
crazy.
which doesn't happen in the gospel stories at all. In other words, the temple gets destroyed by the Romans,
Right.
in the year 70. So in other words, 4 decades from now or whatever is when it happens. In this movie, it kind of gets destroyed by an earthquake, and so we'll see that. So they keep on making this point about the destroying the temple.
There's an earthquake in Matthew,
Matthew.
but it doesn't destroy the temple.
No, the only thing that happens is the veil is rent, the curtain in the temple that's separating the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, from the outer sanctum.
It makes
a
a
big deal.
theological,
It's a theological point. Yeah.
that says like now the
God-
whole of humanity is no longer separate from God.
Right.
But
God will make a dwelling everywhere.
Right.
But there's an earthquake in this movie where the whole temple gets kind of cut in half. So anyway, as one of the places again where Jesus says, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." And now we see the two
other criminals
that are on either side of him. And there's
a lot of quotes at this, a lot of
Yeah.
Jesus sayings at this point.
Well, now this is coming from, so there's the three crosses in the synoptics. Mark and Matthew have the original one where the two guys, they're not named, but they both taunt him. But then in Luke changes it and has one of the two, this guy saying that that they actually deserve it. So he is the kind of repentant criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the one who's the unrepentant one. So the unrepentant one is Gesmas, and what's the other name? But anyway, these are traditional names that come again from the Acts of Pilate, I think, from the Gospel of Nicodemus, the later apocryphal things. And so in this quotation from Luke, the repentant one says to Jesus, "All I ask is you remember me when you come into your kingdom." So and so this is the one occasion where anywhere in the Gospels, Jesus says this, this day you'll be with me in paradise. And so this is, I think, the only example we have in the canonical
Jesus
Gospels where someone is specifically identified as being, this guy was saved for sure, and he's going to be in paradise. I don't know.
Oh,
So maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's the only one example of that. But so that's this one. So then there is a lot of
the sky darkens.
Yeah, there's a lot of photography of clouds going by and everything like that. And
He's still alive.
he's still alive. The soldiers are down there, gambling over the clothes. Mary and John come. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is able to touch Jesus' feet, kiss Jesus' feet, and then she gets blood all over herself for the rest of the movie. Jesus says, "I thirst," and so the Roman soldier takes the sponge and puts it on a sphere. On a spear, and puts vinegar or whatever probably next to him. So the idea may be that this is, depending on which version of this is, it's the if it's in the Gospel of John where they put the spear up like this, it's an
all
imitation of the
fulfillments.
it's the fulfillment of Jesus as the Passover sacrifice, and this blood is put over the lintels with the hyssop and the sponge and things like that. If it's they gave me vinegar to drink, this is from like the Matthew version. It's a fulfillment of the suffering servant from the Psalms.
Like even like having the Jesus crucified with the other criminals is a fulfillment
of the suffering servant in the
Which, by the way, the suffering servant, I think, deserves a footnote of like what the suffering servant is, because the suffering servant is, well, for Christians that would be
it's Jesus.
Jesus, but that's not the case.
But for Isaiah and for the Psalms, it's most likely Israel. So in other words, it's meant to be
like a metaphor of the people of Israel.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's what the whole Handel's Messiah libretto is about. It's the suffering servant.
Yeah. And so now, like, there's cosmic chaos that's going on all around them, and so the Romans are, starting to panic and things like that. But meanwhile, Mary wants to, die with it. That's a line that's not in anywhere in the Gospels. Maybe it's again from your source.
This might be from Emmerich's book.
Yeah.
That really focuses on Mary.
But then there is a line that he does now from the Gospel of John where he says, "Woman, this is behold your son, and son, behold your mother." And so, so he gives John and Mary become Mary, the mother of Jesus, become a new family at this very end. And then
it is finished.
Well, he actually uses all of the. I think he says every one of the.
He says all the last words of all the Gospels.
So
right?
all the Gospels have different things. So the Mark and Matthew have, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Right.
And
He
and
says
Luke,
that.
he says into thy hands. What is it? How does it? You have it written down.
Into your hands I commend my spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in John, it is finished.
And it is finished.
And so he says all of those.
That's the very last thing. It is finished.
Yeah. Well, the portrayal of the Jesus as in the Gospel of John, I think, is the dominant one in the movie. And so, but whenever there's a good detail from anything else, then it gets thrown in too. So then when it's finished, then we suddenly get a very interesting God's eye view on Golgotha. So in other words, you pull back, you see all the Romans, they're panicking, we're up at the top and we're seeing the cross from the top. You can see the three crosses, and that pulls back. And as we pull back, we're seeing that through a droplet of water. It's actually a tear that is now falling from heaven. So God the Father, God has now dropped a tear. And then you can see this tear coming down and to hit the earth, and it splashes. This is a crazy fantasy thing to have happen in this thing, and that causes everything, like the earthquake, everything. Yeah. Now the centurion is having his change. I don't think he doesn't say truly this man was the.
I think someone says it at some point. Like the problem is that there's so much noise in the same way that when during Peter's denial, because it doesn't really happen as it happened in the Gospels.
Okay.
Because it happens in the middle of all this chaos.
Everything is chaos. Yeah.
Yeah.
So somebody's probably saying it.
Yeah.
But we just didn't. They didn't translate it. They didn't with the subtitles. I should have been listening stronger to the Latin. Anyways, we see that it's happening everywhere. So Pilate's house, there's an earthquake. And then, like I say, there's an earthquake in the second temple where the whole thing is split in two.
The whole temple is split in half, not just the veil.
And so it's not just the veil. So the veil is definitely split in half and falls down. But now the temple itself has been split in half. And so now everybody's panicking. All the Romans are running away.
But everyone's panicking, but like now the interesting thing now is like, except the family.
Yeah, except the family.
The family have been enlightened. Now the family really understands that they've been redeemed, whereas everyone else now is in fear. The soldiers are in fear.
The Romans have to make sure that all three are dead. And so the soldier takes a spear in his side, and it just bursts this crazy gory amount of blood, like he's like a piñata of blood.
Yeah.
And it just starts splattering everybody, Mary and John, and then also the soldier who just gets covered, and he actually reacts to how much blood gets all around. So anyway, and so like I say, the centurion, he's at least has had that. He understands that this was the Son of God or whatever.
And then these guys realize they begin to understand now. Oh, what have we done?
Because their temple got destroyed.
Yeah.
Even though that didn't happen until 40 years later. But anyway, they're feeling it. And then one of the main characters also finally now realizes what was going on. So unlike, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, where all of the demons and Satan and everybody do know who Jesus is, and it's everybody else who doesn't, in this movie, Satan hasn't known who Jesus was and has been tricked. And so now that Jesus has been swallowed up by death, death has been defeated. And so
it's like a fish hook theory.
Yeah.
So that's why the devil is effectively, like, God has now playing tricks with the devil, and it is like a very mythological kind of idea that it's not just in Christianity that we have this idea that the devil or death swallows up Jesus.
Yeah.
So that from within Jesus can defeat both death and sin and the devil.
I mean, the one part that's in the gospel is that they do in the gospels itself they talk about the sign of Jonah.
Yeah.
And so they take the story of Jonah and the whale typologically, and so they as if that prefigures the death and resurrection of Jesus, and so he goes into the whale and it doesn't kill the whale, but anyway.
No, it doesn't kill the whale.
But in any event, he that's one of the ideas that death has swallowed you.
But that's one of the Christian innovations would be like, this is definite, definitive.
Yeah.
This once it happens, because it also happens in Canaanite mythology, religion with Baal. Yeah. Baal goes into death.
Yeah.
Death swallows up Baal.
Yeah.
But this is a cycle that needs to be repeated.
Yeah. It's like the Mandalorian got swallowed by that.
Yeah, so it's always like that.
By
this
monster
imagery
or whatever, and then he, once the
there's something about going inside death itself, and from there you can fix it, you can overcome it.
Yeah. So you think the movie might be over now that Satan got defeated, but no, they still have the.
And so here we see what the prevalent model of salvation is.
Yeah.
Which would be this Christ victor, but this is like a very using this fishhook addition to it, to the tricking Satan.
Yeah. So the family here, Mary and John, take the body down, even though the gospel accounts say it's Joseph of Arimathea who does it. Maybe that's who that is in the back.
Oh,
I don't know. And so maybe they're hanging out with them. But essentially, it's so that we can get the Pietà painting or the statues, right? And so essentially, we have this framed image, and this has happened throughout a lot of the movie, where part of the effect of the movie is because it is trying to imitate all of this artwork. It has a surreal feel to it at all times, as opposed. And this is maybe one of the reasons why. On the one time, the gore is ratcheted up to 500%, and then it's also ethereal.
And but it is scenes like this that actually, in a way, I appreciate. All I wish is
But I'm just saying that maybe
I was hoping to see more of this.
I'm just saying that maybe the combination though made it less emotionally affecting for me, because it doesn't make it feel. I don't know. It feels. Even when these guys who we were seeing all these reaction shots from Mary and John, and normally when people are crying on screen, that would have more. I just shouldn't have maybe been so hard-hearted in this whole movie, but in any event, I was watching it maybe a little bit because we were thinking of reviewing it. I don't know.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, more critical eye.
And then the last scene, the rock is being rolled. But we're seeing it from inside instead of from outside, and in a kind of a fantasy effect, Jesus's clothes are, or death clothes, kind of are deflating, like like the Wicked Witch, like Obi-Wan Kenobi
deflating.
after he gets struck down by Darth Vader. So the clothes deflate, and then we see again, completely not depicted in any of the gospel accounts. We're seeing
Jesus actually walking
out
of the tomb.
And so
and there's silence once again. He's healed except for the hand.
Yeah, and so then
the wound is still there, and that would be very much in line with Julian of Norwich visions and also Emmerich's visions that really focus on the wounds, even here in the
even a fully perfected resurrected body, it still has the wounds.
And Jesus is naked, not John, but Jesus is.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end.
Okay. Well, that's very unusual for me not to look at the chat during the lecture, but I had seen a couple of comments already, so hopefully we'll see if we have some questions that we can address. But before we do that, so what do you think? Did you like the movie?
So
would you recommend it to those who haven't seen it?
It's the gruesome parts are so long and gruesome. I don't like that part. I was sort of enamored with the part where they start talking Latin, which I thought, and I think that I thought there was a lot of interesting visuals, even if I wouldn't. I think that the goal of it is not to actually try to find what things would have been like in the early first century in Galilee, but rather to depict it like all the romantic paintings of it and those kind of depictions. And so as a result of that, it's visually interesting. I think it was it was much better than I thought it was going to be, because I was one of the reasons why I've never watched it is I was very dubious of it. I ultimately don't like the 19th century source or whatever it is, with the Satan and that kind of component of it.
Yeah, Emmerich.
Because I find that to be, I guess I think that's
the dolorous passion.
The dolorous passion. I don't want to have I don't know. For me, that's a modern fan fiction that is intruding its way into the.
It is fan fiction because it really was compiled by a poet who was translating one language into another when he got home after interviewing this nun all day.
Mm-hmm. So that part I don't like. But I think that in general, I also thought that the cast was all good. It was the depiction of the council and all these kind of things, that was maybe a little especially heavy-handed.
Well, yeah, especially that is heavy-handed, and that's the one issue that I have with the movie, that Gibson really did include that line.
Yeah, but they didn't go down the route that you can go from the gospel accounts, though, where it would be way more. So, like the Gospel of John, it could have been made more. It's kind of ambiguous whether where the council itself may have actually been participating in the crucifixion. It's clear that the Romans are the ones that really did the damage. Right. So they're the drunken Roman rabble soldiers are the ones that really destroyed Jesus physically, and then they are also. However much Pilate wants to wash his hands of it or whatever he wants to do, he's the one that gives the order. So that part is at least clear. That could have been worse.
But however, for what this movie is trying to explore, as I understand it, that's crucial. Because the suffering, the blood, and all the things that are pretty disgusting to watch.
What I meant to say though is that it's that the Romans did it, not the Jews.
But it's the Romans doing that. But that's such an important part of the movie, because it's a movie about salvation ultimately. Because that's how the movie ends. Like the devil loses in that last scene. That was the whole point that we're trying to make here, is how Jesus
both
saves.
Of those things were. That was also way over the top, right? So the devil losing, and then even more than that, this wherever the thing is, this divine.
Oh, the divine tear.
God's tear that splashes on the planet. That's sort of amazing. So there is like, there's some strange over-the-top stuff, anyway.
But I do like, again, I think we, Christians in general, at least today, and maybe I'm thinking mostly of Protestants, don't like to think about the blood, all the violence in the passion narrative. Because in fact, most Protestants today, they go from Palm Sunday to Easter.
Yeah.
Like the standard common lectionary pretty much skips all this every year.
Right. So we don't do that in our.
We don't do that here, but if you follow the lectionary, as most Protestant churches do,
that's one of the reasons why we stopped doing that.
Yeah, you don't get this, so you sort of like pretty much don't forget about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to reflect on this. It's like how witnessing suffering, how that transforms people. And I think this is the thing that ultimately I believe this movie is trying to do. It's trying to transform the viewer by just having us just go through all these horrific scenes, just trigger some kind of transformation akin to like Gilgamesh being transformed when he sees the suffering of Enkidu dying of this horrendous disease. That's when Gilgamesh moral character starts to develop. He was like an immature idiot up until that point, and only then he realizes, okay, I have to figure things out. And it's the same thing when you think of the story of the Buddha.
Yeah.
The Buddha is he lived this perfect life in the palace as a super spoiled prince.
Yep.
He had no idea about suffering. He goes out of the palace, and now, there's suffering, there's old people, there's disease, and there's death. Right. It's only that begins to trigger his enlightenment. And so we're seeing that in the Christian context, except that it's a little bit over the top in this movie, perhaps, but we do have that.
But I guess then part of the issue, though, that conflicts it for me is the mixture of the really human. So we have like two levels of Christology that are really mixed up here.
Yes.
So if we had the really human low Christology, Markan kind of Christology, then I think it might have been, you might have felt the suffering more, but since we're constantly, being visited to, in the movie, we're constantly getting to the John Jesus, who is completely impassive and is always in control of everything. Do you identify with him as much when he's suffering, or does he only seem to be suffering, that leads, I don't know.
And again, that's the issue. How do we put all those together? Well, okay. Atención. I just looked at the queue. Oh my God! I don't know, what time is it? We're gonna be here all night.
Okay.
Good.
Well, thank you for sticking with us, everybody.
Okay, go ahead. You read.
I can read some reactions here. These are some reactions that people have shared. So Kasumi Rina says, the gore didn't offend me. Pretentiously adding inaccurate modern Latin instead of Koine Greek did. Who spoke liturgical Latin in Judea? It was as foreign to them as English, so the filmmakers might have just used English. Yeah, exactly. So, like we said,
that's the same point. Why do you use these ancient languages?
It was so weird. Again, like we talked about. It's possible that we could have those rabble soldiers speaking not liturgical Latin but classical Latin. In slang, which they might have been doing, but then most everybody should have been speaking Koine Greek, just like Kasumi says. Dartharama says, I cried for 2 straight hours, no matter what a person's religious affiliation. It's sickening to watch Jesus be relentlessly tortured. So yeah, Dartharama, I can totally see that, that why you would have had that experience. Like I said, I think that the only reason why I was shielded from that is that I just stepped back from it.
It was that we were just doing research in a way, not really watching a movie. I think that's what saved us.
Oh, maybe. I don't know if I would have been able. I think I would have disassociated anyway because it's just so much. K. Tempest Bradford says, I didn't cry, I just cringed. It was so over the top, I couldn't emotionally connect with it. So I think I'm in that same camp with K. Tempest Bradford. Paula Strange says, I felt so uncomfortable and sick for most of the movie. I imagine I would feel the same watching a dog fight. I didn't find anything redeeming in it. So I didn't have the effect that it was going for.
I think unfortunately that's what Gibson's ultimately the mistake here was the over exaggerate things.
But
I don't know.
I feel like it also though it might just be it's not a universal movie, right? So it might for him I'm sure it does have that effect, but maybe it's because you have to have a certain. I don't know because even growing up as a Catholic, we do see the Jesus in the Catholic Church usually has the crown of thorns and blood, and there's we see the Jesus with the wounded heart. That's a very common iconography that we see even in textbooks for kids, but it's not the same as this. No, yeah. Kevin Joyce says, I said it was a religious snuff film. It made me ill. It is the only movie I almost walked out of. It was that vile. So, I mean, it's hard to disagree. So, for myself, Magic Mike, thank you for your support, Magic Mike. Magic Mike asks, do you think a more realistic or practical depiction of Jesus' life as a teacher will ever be made? Would it be received as offensive or be funded? Well, in this case, it isn't that easy, I think, to make these because of it's controversial, I think, and also it's not clear what the market always is. So Mel Gibson made this all by himself. So he had a lot of money, and he has a company, and he I think funded it, and he did very well.
Yeah.
It may be that.
Oh, I remember this movie was
in terms of a more realistic, practical depiction of Jesus' life as a teacher. There may be a bunch of other movies because.
Yeah, we have to watch more movies.
Yeah. So you guys are gonna have to say in the comments whether this format you like this at all.
What should we watch?
Going on for 2 hours. Maybe you're bored by this, but I've found it very interesting. So, David,
I just want to say thank you to the NA Works for supporting the channel.
David Latour says, I wonder if there were any atheists in antiquity. So there are people who are called atheists in antiquity, but it wouldn't be in the modern sense of how we understand atheism. And so, for example, Christians were accused of being atheists because they didn't believe that all of the gods that everybody else believed in were gods. And so it's a matter of it was a designation that people would use to attack each other for a different conception of how the universe worked. But because there was no appreciation of causation the way we have it in modern science, all kinds of things that we have a natural explanation for why they happen would be understood as occurring because of the gods or as occurring as part of the divine realm. And so
there was in antiquity more sophisticated thinkers that may have been accused of atheism by not paying homage to anthropomorphic gods.
But that didn't mean that they didn't believe in what they were theists in what we would think of. So so Socrates would have been accused of atheism, but he still has a belief that there is one kind of a divine source.
Right.
And same thing with Plato. So I would say in general there people are accused of it, but even the most seemingly what we think of now atheistic of the philosophers like the Epicureans, they didn't actually deny the existence of the gods. They just said that they were pointless. And so it would be so the answer is we'll look at this. We're gonna have a lecture on this next week. Kasumi Rina says, how many times does the devil appear in the entire Bible at all? Considering how much the devil's in this movie, So Job, the desert. Is that it? The snake and the beast in Revelation are different characters.
But not really in Job.
So in Job, it's the Satan.
It's the Satan
that appears. The accuser is who appears.
Which is like a functionary of the court of of God in Deuteronomy, but it's not the same as this devil, who is like an independent player, like a sentience that is antagonistic to God. In Job, it's pretty much there. It's God and Satan who decide, okay, let's see who wins. I say this guy has no moral grounds. He's good just because you give him everything.
Gave him all these blessings.
And God says, oh, no, I'm gonna take everything away so that we can see who's right. So that it's a game between these two kind of deities in a way.
Well, in any event, the accuser is part of God's court. He's one of the sons of God, of El, that are being called to, say, well, where have you been? I'm wandering here and there, and that kind of thing.
But it's God, the one who allows the Satan to do all these things to Job.
He recognizes that he's in your power, do as you have to.
As opposed to what we see in this movie, that the devil that we have in this movie is a very cosmological kind of character who actually is the one that all humanity is enslaved to.
So we've done a biography of the devil, and so between the earliest parts of the Old Testament to be written, where a cosmological devil is not part of their understanding, to the time period when the Christian Gospels are written, that has entered into the cosmology, and so he doesn't make a lot of appearances, but it's a background understanding that all of the New Testament writers have. So.
But even in like the snake in Genesis, it's not the same kind of character.
Definitely not. That's reinterpreted that way as the devil later. Like, for example, in the book of Revelations, they'll call the devil the old serpent, and is referring to the Genesis story, but that's not how the intent of the author of Genesis was. Diana Patterson says, I saw this film with a Jewish friend.
I think we skipped kinetic.
Okay, so you can...
Oh, yeah. Why did Satan want to kiss Jesus? I don't know.
Well, that's why I skipped the question, because I don't remember that.
Perfect.
So
yeah, we'll look it up.
All right. Diana Patterson says, I saw this film with a Jewish friend whose huge concern was that Mary held the body of Christ as in the Pieta, but he said that Jews are forbidden to touch the dead. Any thoughts? This is definitely not a historically, it's not meant to be a historically accurate movie, right? So in other words, if we were trying to portray this, like, let's reconstruct an account, let's say, that would be realistic to what we know of history at the time, this wouldn't be it. What this is doing is reconstructing the art of the Pieta. That said, we know how regulations in Jewish law after rabbinic Judaism emerges in the centuries that are now following this time period, and so all of these sorts of customs, ritual customs about purity that are incumbent upon priests, those become incumbent upon everybody at a certain point, and the exact transition, I think, isn't as well known. And so it's possible here, but but I need to know exactly what what all of the customs are. So some of the things where we have rules like that were incumbent upon priests, let's say, in the year 100 BC or 200 BC, those are not yet, and then they're going to become things that all Jews follow in rabbinic Judaism beginning, let's say, 300 or 400 AD, that we don't know for sure what Galilean Judeans, what they might have exactly practiced in the year 30, because we just don't have enough sources for that yet.
So yeah, in other words, there's like several levels of complexity here. On the one hand, was that really a practice at the time
for everybody?
For everyone, and two, was it widespread? And do we have evidence that people actually just subscribe to those rules? I mean, we even know that it's only within the Hasmonean period that a lot of practices that we consider quintessentially Jewish started to be widespread.
Practiced at all, or even become an association. So I haven't actually looked that particular thing up and what we could do, but what I say is that the makers of this movie haven't actually even, that isn't their objective. What their objective would be is, we have these traditional art of the Pietà, and so we want to have that be in the movie, because the movie is depicting the art.
Yeah, it's a work of art, right? And I think that it's very consciously
it's built on tradition as opposed to history. Miguel Angel says, Mel Gibson kind of seems to think that Palestine is somewhere in Europe, ignoring as much of the Greek world as possible. So yeah, I mean, this was filmed in Italy, and we've deleted Greeks from early Christianity, and if anything, even like if the Bible quotations that are given in Hebrew, they might have been given, anyway, for early Christians anyway, they're read in Greek.
But there's also absolutely no imagery that suggests that this was a Hellenistic society,
right?
And there was like a super stark contrast between the Judeans and the Romans, and
right.
As opposed to
the Judeans look very Persian.
They look Persian, like old-fashioned Persians,
right?
As opposed to Persians in the first century AD,
right?
And then so this was a society that, like, this contrast in people was probably not as obvious as the movie wants us to believe.
Right. Yep. N.A. Work says, I did some Googling. According to various sources, Mel Gibson says the movie is meant to be a cinematic Stations of the Cross, but he can't find the exact quote. Yeah, so I thought that too.
That makes sense.
Because we saw it once that started happening. Like we're saying, I guess 12 of the 14 Stations of the Cross are part of the movie. There's only like Jesus meeting with some woman that was a deleted scene and didn't make it in, and then there's the part where the last Station of the Cross, which is where they put Jesus's body in the tomb. So they didn't actually do that in this because they ended on the Pietà. But in any otherwise, it is doing the Stations on the Cross, and it works. So, Magi Mike says, do you think Peter's name, the Rock, was tongue-in-cheek? Could he have been shaky in his loyalty, seeking as James took over the leadership of their group? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know about that. That's a good question.
So the idea is, the question is, so how, it would be, I guess, how, the name for Peter goes all the way back. So we have that from Paul. And so, but then the interpretations of it is what we have in the Gospels. And so then we have to rely on essentially, generations of tradition to explain why the nickname happened, or those kind of things are simply the invention of the evangelists.
Right.
And same thing also, the passion narrative itself. So Peter's betrayal or denial, not betrayal, but betrayal is Judas. Peter's
definitely
denial.
Peter doesn't really look very good.
He doesn't look
in all these gospel accounts.
It becomes ironic. It becomes tongue-in-cheek, Mike, Magi Mike, because of what happens, I guess.
Although, but at the same time, as a result, Peter is like every man. Peter is very much like us, that with the same kind of problem that Peter has is the problem of the believer. That we know that the Christian believer says, yes, I have to follow Jesus no matter what. But then when the critical time comes, then you don't. And so that's very much Peter in the Gospels.
Yeah, because the Gospels are literary. And so Peter's character, acquires that character when the first Gospel writer writes this down, the author of Mark. And so the author of Mark, who is trying very much to get every reader to become a disciple, they want him, when Jesus is asking, who do you say that I am? And Peter supplies an answer. You're supposed to be doing that.
So you have to see yourself in Peter.
Yeah. So it's a literary. Kevin Joyce says, may I just say as a physician that no human, and Jesus was human in addition to being a God, could ever live through the torture and scourging that Mel Gibson has put him through.
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
it
and
becomes
so that's
docetism, right? So he's not fully human anymore.
And so that's why, as this scene of the flagellation goes on and on and on, it's like you don't see a human there anymore. And as you see, is that it would be impossible for a human to survive that, and that's really doesn't work
in terms of the idea,
like what Jesus is supposed to represent.
Patty O'Reilly says, where were Mary's other sons and daughters when Jesus was being crucified? Is the other Mary Jesus' sister Mary? So we don't know who the other Mary is. I think if the other Mary was Jesus' sister, then they would probably say Mary, the sister of Jesus, as opposed to the other Mary, because you'd have a reason to, you'd have a way to identify her. In terms of where they are, so again, the first narrative gospel is Mark. And so Mark is hostile to Jesus' family. And so Mark doesn't assign a lot of roles for them. And it's only the other later gospel writers that want to rehabilitate, especially Mary. And so that's how Mary gets placed in these kind of places, or gets an expanded role. So in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus' siblings are portrayed as thinking that he has a demon in him and that sort of thing.
Right.
So kind of antagonistic to his ministry. That's not also what we find, though, because for the historical Jesus, because we have the observations of Paul that in fact Jesus' brother James took over the leadership of the community in Jerusalem after Jesus' execution. So, the NA work says, because you have talked about the relics, the Shroud of Turin has been in the news cycle a few times this year. Something about it being redated to much earlier. Does John know anything about these updates and have any comments? Have you heard about the updates?
No, I haven't heard about the updates on the relics, but yeah, it's...
So my understanding of this, I mean, I haven't read the most recent update about what time frame it would be. But I have seen I saw something where it was shown how the thing would have been able to be formed, and my take on it right now is that this is a medieval relic, and that it formed naturally because of a cloth was in a negative space, and it took this imprint of an actual piece of artwork or whatever that was around, but then when people found it, they were impressed by it, and that's where and that's how it acquired its status.
But ultimately, it's at least in all my recent research that I had to do going through seminary, whether we can associate this relic to we can extend the antiquity of a relic.
You still can't connect it.
We can't really connect it to any person or like Jesus, even if it turns out that this relic is in fact 2,000 years old. How can we really connect it to Jesus? That's
if you have a fragment of the true cross, like King Charles has one that the Pope gave him, if you carbon date that and it turns out that it's exactly 2,000 years old or whatever, then that
doesn't mean that it's the cross.
Yeah, because the provenance doesn't allow for it. There's a 300-year gap between where the earliest time anybody had a hold of that thing, and the time when it would have been. There's no real connection. It's something that people want to have relics, and these are traditional relics that have been around for 1,000 years or so, but they don't go all the way back to the historical Jesus. Kerman Wingfield says, so what about John 20:17, where Jesus says, "Don't touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father," so he ascends to himself. So essentially, we don't get to that part yet. So because the thing ends where Jesus, I guess we don't know where we don't. So that part is not shown. That happens off
the resurrection
camera, right?
is like the one of the best parts of the Gospel of John is just absent here.
Right, and so what we have is the part that doesn't exist in the Gospels, which is Jesus walking out of the tomb, or he's about to walk out of the tomb when the movie ends, and so the implication here, Kerman, I guess, would be like that he walks out of the tomb and is hanging, gets a robe and is hanging around as the gardener for a while. In the Gospel of John, he then meets Mary, who's weeping in the garden. She thinks this is the gardener until he says her name, and then she realizes it's him. And so at that point he would say, "Don't touch me because I haven't ascended to the Father." He hasn't ascended because he has, in the case of how the movie would be having here, that he's just walked out of the tomb and done that.
But we have to remember that the chapter 20 of John has this very, very weird thing that all of a sudden the narrative is in present tense. It had been up until the end of chapter 19, and it in perfect, John is a very good Greek writer. So John knows his verb tenses in Greek, but in chapter 20, there's a lot that happens in the present tense. So it is a very theological presentation that John is doing in chapter 20, as opposed to an historical narrative that should make historical sense. Like, just don't touch me now because I'm in the body, and then I have to ascend. Then I will not have a body. That's it's all a heavy theological construct that John is presenting there.
Fire Ever Living says, this film is sometimes accused of being very anti-Semitic, but is it actually any more anti-Semitic than the Gospels themselves? So the Gospels, in terms of anti-Semitism, have the advantage of having been written early, before anti-Semitism really develops, and it's written by people who are within, in some cases the author of Matthew anyway has grown up, in considering himself Jewish, who is now a Christian, and so he's anything but, he's not attempting in any way to be anti-Semitic. What they are trying to be is, so they have gone through a schism. They no longer consider themselves to be of the same religion, and as they are creating boundaries, they are identifying themselves against people who have not become Christian, and so there is boundary maintenance, but it isn't as much, I think, at the time anti-Semitic for first century writers. The problem for the movie is that we have had now the development of anti-Semitism in real ways, and so we have to be very, very, very thoughtful of it. There's been a lot of arguments on either side about whether this has crossed a bunch of lines and become anti-Semitic or whether it hasn't. So I was reading Roger Ebert thought it wasn't, but I don't know.
In a sense, you can say that the gospel, especially for example, the Gospel of John, that is constantly talking about the Jews, or the Judeans, that you can use it for anti-Semitic purposes, but it can
inspire anti-Semitism for sure,
and can inspire it. But that's why the Bible in general can be a very dangerous book if you take passages out of context without knowing how to read them properly. You can do a lot of damage, anti-Semitism, and all sorts of bigotry against queer people and women, you name it. So yes, in context, you can tell, as John was explaining, that this is a community developing its identity in a very tumultuous time.
I definitely feel discomfort where you have very kind of, let's say, stereotypically Jewish-looking older guys who are dressed up in all of these robes.
That is.
And that they are constantly, there's 12 of them that all walk around together, ride around on donkeys and things like that, and are yelling crucify him, and things like that. That's that depiction made me uncomfortable.
And if you look at the movie, is every depiction, with the exception of the Jesus movement people, the disciples, Mary,
I think
and John.
they can look somewhat stereotypically Jewish too.
But everyone else is depicted in a very negative light, except those who come to the side of Jesus, like Simon.
Yeah.
But yeah, everyone else is not really portrayed in a very sympathetic light. Only Jesus' followers and Pilate and his wife.
Yeah. Yeah. Ron Wagner says, have you ever heard of artistic license? I think you guys are taking things too literally. So there we go.
Yeah, see, but the problem is for a lot of people, like a lot of faithful Christians who don't necessarily are theologically trained, or they understand exegesis, or probably don't read the Bible very carefully, then this becomes something that informs their faith. And I was talking to someone today who said, oh yeah, in my church, we watch that every Easter.
Oh my.
I was like, why this movie? I don't know. But then that really...
Yeah, that would affect how you're thinking of it, right? So
then
the movie would imprint
this
on
is the Bible,
Well,
probably.
this is the thing, like, like I always say, like with Braveheart informed this friend of mine who's Scottish, his idea of his own Scottish nationalism, even though the movie is is historically terrible, right? And so, but it did inform his current hatred of the English as a result. Ken Smith says, as much as I like the movie, my problem has been that Gibson turned Jesus into a Catholic.
Well, I'm sorry, but Jesus apparently speaks Latin. So.
Now we know. Zorak 1997 says, Gibson should have cast more Jews for an authentic feel. Larry David as Caiaphas, Gilbert Godfrey as Peter, Adam Sandler as Judas, William Shatner as Nicodemus, maybe in the sequel.
No, yeah, that would be. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Larry David, but I think
I like Larry David.
But
and Anders and Lister, thank you for your support. He says, I love this chat. What's your next movie?
Yeah, and Dartharema was asking why this movie and what's the next movie. I think this movie picked itself, I would say. The movie picked us.
I think that this is the most famous, I mean, it's certainly in terms of a recent movie, this movie made a lot of money. And it was a huge blockbuster, and it's one I'd never seen. So I think that's why and it's also one I thought I didn't want to see. And so I think that's why we picked this one, to start with.
Well, everyone wants The Last Temptation. I saw that in the chat.
That was another one that I've never seen that,
today.
and that's one that probably we should go to next.
Yeah.
I haven't, because my temptation is to go, like back into the old, the old sandals, and in other words, because I love movies like, I love the Ten Commandments and Cleopatra or whatever, but so watching Ben-Hur or something is something that I watched as a kid and I wouldn't mind seeing again. But no, we should see The Last Temptation of Christ, which is another movie that I have actually never watched. I don't know if you've seen. Have you seen that?
I probably saw clips. Okay. Yeah, part of.
So the fun thing for all of you guys is that we've never watched any of these movies.
I have seen. I recently saw a really, really terrible movie about the Exodus, but yeah, I don't. It came out recently,
yeah.
So
okay.
and that's usually the problem with some of these Bible-based movies, that sometimes it's just really, really bad takes on trying to find, like in this movie especially, they're trying to make the Exodus make it historical sense.
Okay.
Or it was some kind of hurricane that took all the water away. That kind of movie. And I have very little patience for movies like that. But this movie actually had a lot of theological propositions. It wasn't about trying to make the story historical. So I appreciate that there's a complexity in this movie.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, very good. Leandro, this was a fun thing to be able to do. We can't always put together you know,
We
all
actually
of the
ended up
slides of a
doing a
lecture.
lot of work for
Yeah,
this
we
thing,
did. We did a
so-
bunch of research and we had a lot of fun watching it, and hopefully you guys had fun. As part of the chat, watching, hearing along with our takes.
But
And
next week you'll get serious again.
next
with
week we're serious. We'll do
Protestantism
a
as
lecture
atheism.
on
No,
the
the other way
development
around.
of the modern atheist movement. All right, thanks again.
Thank you.